Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the last of our three 2020 virtual conference webinars. I'm your AFGA president, Victor Benz, and I'll be the moderator for this evening's event. This webinar format we are using will permit you, the viewer, to actively participate in these discussions. Please use the raise hand function to signal your desire to contribute to the discussion and to the question and answer session that will follow the presentation. As moderator, I will recognize you and permit you to talk. Then you will be able to unmute yourself, identify yourself, and say your piece. Once that discussion is finished, I will repeat the process with the next one to have raised their hand. Also, if you wish, the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen is available to ask questions. I will moderate that as well. Tonight we have with us Mr. Brian Rudick, the AFGA's new hunting chair. I will now turn the webinar over to Brian to introduce his guest and describe tonight's session. Brian?
Great, thanks, Victor, and thanks everyone for attending. And just like to say, it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce to you Dr. Mark Boyce, who's going to put on our webinar for us tonight. It's fantastic to have educators and researchers of his stature right within our own kind of small community here in Alberta. So I don't want to spend too much time talking when we can listen to an expert like that. So I asked Mark for a little bit of a help in providing an introduction for him, and so I'll just go through that now. So Mark Boyce was educated at Yale and Oxford and is a professor of ecology at the University of Alberta. Dr. Boyce was renewed last month for another term as the Alberta Conservation Association chair in fisheries and wildlife, position which is endowed with levies from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses. Research by his students includes population dynamics and predator-prey interactions, mostly with large mammals, including elk, deer, wolves, bears, cougars, and furbearers. His 350 research papers have been cited over 35,000 times, making him the most highly referenced wildlife biologist in all of North America. Since 2014, he has been a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and received the 2016 Miroslav Romanowski Medal for his research using science to solve environmental problems. Mark is married to Evelyn Merrill, who is Professor Emeritus with continuing research on CWD in mule deer in Alberta. And I've been fortunate enough to sit in on some of Dr. Merrill's sessions on CWD. So again, another great resource for our province. They have 3 rowdy sons and 2 perfect grandchildren. This is where Mark and I can really relate. I have perfect grandchildren as well. And Mark has been a member of the Sherwood Park Fish and Game Association since 1999. And speaking with Mark, I was pleased to hear him say that the most important thing that we needed to provide for his introduction, that he's an Iowa farm boy who loves hunting, fishing, and trapping. So starting from our roots, so important in telling the story of who we are. So Mark is going to present tonight on some of the research he's been doing with increased harvest numbers with elk populations, even with high populations of predators and carnivores that could affect those numbers. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Mark Boyce.
Thanks, Brian. There we go. So as Brian mentioned, I grew up on a farm-haul tractor in Iowa and couldn't wait to get off the farm, especially because I knew there was an opportunity to study at university in wildlife. And so I went to Iowa State University, which has had a long-standing program in fish and wildlife biology. Paul Arrington, who's illustrated here, was instrumental in starting that program. Paul Arrington was one of Aldo Leopold's students, and is very well known for his work on muskrats and mink and cottontail rabbits and bobwhite quail. Certainly a very influential scientist. But you know, I went through the program at Iowa State, and I took all of these ologies like ornithology and mammalogy and ichthyology, and I loved the coursework. It was just fantastic. Lots of natural history and taxonomy, and I enjoyed that part of the program very much. But at the end of the day, our capstone course in the Fish and Wildlife Biology program was a course in wildlife management techniques. And that struck me as wanting. There was something not quite right, that we didn't have a solid theoretical underpinning for our studies in fish and wildlife biology. And so then I went on to do my graduate studies at the University of Alaska, and then later at Yale. And it was there where I picked up on the theory side and really immersed myself in the writings of Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson, Bob May, some of the people doing theoretical work. And then I got my first job actually teaching a course in ecological theory at University of Wyoming. And I really enjoyed that interface between ecology and the theory behind ecology and management. And it was really clear to me that existed, but even at that time, there hadn't been an integration made until this book came out called Conservation Biology. It was by Michael Soule and Bruce Wilcox in 1980. And I was just gobsmacked with this book. And in fact, in 1981, I taught one of the very first conservation biology courses offered in North America, using this book as a textbook. And I just delighted in this interface between theory and management, exploring what kinds of predictions we get out of theory, and then how those apply to management. But there was pushback from the traditional wildlife people. Jim Tier in particular wrote a scathing review of Soule and Wilcox's book, claiming that it was not well grounded, that we need more applied kinds of programs in wildlife management and in forestry and in fisheries, where people understand what you can do in the field and what kinds of applications seem most reasonable. Well, this interaction between sort of the theory and the applied side reached actually, I think, an interesting pinnacle with these two guys. And Ian McTaggart-Cowan is unquestionably the father of wildlife biology in Canada. He was Dean of Graduate Studies and Dean of the faculty at University of British Columbia. Retired, I think, about 1975, but then he went back and became Chancellor of the University of Victoria. He wrote this big 4-volume tome, or contributed to this 4-volume tome on the birds of British Columbia. But he published an enormous amount of very basic wildlife science on wolves and moose and deer. Dave Klein was one of his students, and Val Geist was one of his students. And Val Geist, as I'm sure most of you know, was on faculty at University of Calgary He died just last year, but Val and Cowan wrote this book entitled Wildlife Conservation Policy. And this book sort of set the stage for the development of what we now call the North American model of wildlife conservation. And they outlined the reasons for our enormous success at managing wildlife in North America that included laws and restrictions, treaties, the North American, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, excuse me, and funding programs like in the United States, they have the Pittman-Robertson program. We tried to get that going under the Harper government, but it didn't go anywhere. And this duck stamp program that was has been very influential in providing funding to purchase wetlands in Western North America, including Alberta, but down in North Dakota and South Dakota and Montana. Vast areas of wetlands have been set aside from the sale of duck stamps. So a variety of funding vehicles helped to push along this enormously successful program that we've had in North America that has resulted in the recovery of white-tailed deer, of pronghorn, of elk, of Canada geese, waterfowl more broadly. And so wild turkeys. We've had so many success stories because of this, the way this program runs. But one of the fundamental elements in the North American model is what Geist calls the Roosevelt Doctrine, that science basically must provide the foundation for how we manage wildlife. And in fact, one might make the case that science is the arbiter of knowledge in modern society. Medawar has a book, he's a philosopher of science, that science lays claim to the most successful human enterprise ever, a pinnacle of human achievement. And it's true in courts as well. Peer-reviewed publication of scientific work holds sway in the courts of both Canada and the United States. So Aldo Leopold was one of the people who promoted a wildlife science program. But as I mentioned, there's somewhat of a disconnect here because of the lack of theory in the early days. And in fact, one might question how well we actually use science in this scheme of things. For example, monitoring. We know how to monitor. For example, aerial ungulate surveys for moose and for pronghorn and other species that you can count from the air. We can collect those data, but it's very expensive to do so. To do one WMU for moose, for example, using the gas-away method, costs about $60,000. And so it's so expensive that in Alberta, we only monitor our moose herds once every 10 years or so, sometimes even less than that. And so instead, we sort of manage by the seat of our pants. There's an enormous weakness on the science behind sustainable yield. Issues of resilience, how well populations rebound after perturbations, the hydra effect, that is the interaction between density dependence and harvesting that creates intermediate optimum harvest levels. We can have higher survival and higher numbers of animals by harvesting some than by not harvesting at all. That would be a good topic for another full hour presentation. Another issue in this whole context of how we apply science in wildlife is this notion of adaptive management, that we sort of try to integrate science into how we manage. We do some sort of management manipulation. Let's say we double the harvest on elk in a unit. And then we monitor to see what consequence it has. And then we collect data and we look to see what the results were relative to the predictions that we made at the beginning. And then we use that information to go back and we fix our model and make a new prediction of how we think the system should respond to management. And we keep iterating that. But Walter's pointed out, we just don't do it. It's just not done for a variety of reasons. It's expensive to do it well, but it requires active manipulation, and we have to have those monitoring data. And then there's this issue that, like I said, in courts of law, peer-reviewed publication is what is sort of expected to ensure that we have quality science that meets the muster, that is adequate to warrant it's being considered scientific result. And oftentimes peer-reviewed standard isn't really upheld by agencies. Alberta Fish and Wildlife doesn't really give all that much credence to the publication, peer-reviewed publication by its staff. It's not a priority in, say, their merit salary increases or anything of the sort. And so at the end of the day, oftentimes our management is done by the seat of our pants, by experience. And experience is, this quote from Oscar Wilde, it's the hardest kind of teacher. It gives you the test first and then the lesson afterwards. So we could do a better job if we would actually use the scientific method ahead of the game to improve how we do wildlife conservation. And Kyle Artell, who was one of Chris Daramont's students, wrote a couple of papers about this. Perhaps the most comfortable to read is this one in American Scientist in 2019, who claims that the management of animal populations just isn't up to speed. It's not the best in the world. It's not science-based. And there's an enormous opportunity to improve our applications of science in wildlife management. So I'm going to go through an example, and this is going to be uncomfortable for some of you. This will probably be the first time that anybody in a Fish and Game presentation has presented simultaneous differential equations, but you're going to get a dose of it anyway, and I'll skip over the math and get to the punchline. But Volterra, back in the 1920s, wrote some equations to describe how predator and prey can interact. And he's a mathematician, straight up, but his son-in-law was a fisheries biologist who documented these enormous oscillations in fisheries that occurred after World War I. So during the war, the fisheries were essentially shut down, but after the war, everything was kind of upset because they had shut down the fishery for a while, and so you had these responses by all these different types of fishes, and the chondrichthyes and the osteichthyes were oscillating back and forth. And Vito Volterra said, I think I know how that works in terms of a predator-prey interaction. So he wrote down these equations, and these are differential equations that are very fundamental in ecology. And you just set these equations equal to 0 to find the long-term equilibrium. But the sort of the magic result here is that from these early equations, he described what's called the Volterra Principle, that if you increase the death rate for both the predator and the prey, the consequence is an increase in the equilibrium abundance of the prey and a decrease in the equilibrium abundance of predators. That's pretty profound. And in fact, Joan Roughgarden pointed out that the Volterra principle is robust, meaning it's a general principle, and that if you look at more complex predator-prey systems with more species in there, with more complicated functional responses and numerical responses and predation rates and whatnot, you can fiddle with it about any which way you want, and it holds. This prediction from Volterra that if you harvest, that you increase the mortality on both the predator and the prey, the outcome is an increase in the number of prey, but a decrease in the equilibrium long-term abundance of predators. So I'm going to carry on in context of those predictions and what we've observed for elk populations in Alberta. Now, as I'm sure you all know, elk were pretty well wiped out in 1956 due to a rabies epidemic. And the provincial and federal governments were aggressively involved in eliminating wolves, essentially from the southern half of the province completely. There were, according to John Gunson, as many as 1,500 wolves in the far north of Alberta, but poisoning and aerial gunning was used to eliminate them. There was one pack of wolves in Jasper National Park in the 1970s. John Weaver did his PhD thesis studying that single pack, and then they expanded into the Nordegg area around Bjorgi, and John Gunson studied that population. And then they expanded into Banff National Park in 1985. And by 1988, they had made it to the US border. But then since then, wolves have just filled it all up. Throughout the green zone of Alberta, wolves are pretty much at saturation density. I don't know where you put another pack. You know, they pretty well have filled it all up, and we have wolves pretty much throughout the green zone of Alberta now, and we just sort of nip away at them a little bit. We harvest about 12 to 13% of the population every year, whereas we know that it would take 30 to 40% harvest to be able to actually reduce the number of wolves. Sorry, this is Christine Robichaud, who was my student who studied the recovery of wolves in Alberta. And then a graduate student of mine, Andrea Morehouse, looked at the prey in southwestern Alberta. So we're talking Pincher Creek area, up to the Livingston Range, down to Waterton Lakes National Park. And we had radio collars. We put radio collars on these packs of wolves. We actually had 2 radio collars on each pack. And then we monitored these wolves. And if we got multiple relocations at the same spot, it was almost surely because they killed something. So Andrea would go in and check out these clusters, these GPS clusters of radio telemetry relocations to see what they killed. And during the grazing season, we're talking May through October, 45% of what they killed were cattle, 22% deer, only 13% were elk. In the wintertime, when cattle were brought into the ranches, the proportion of kills, of livestock kills, went down substantially. But Andrea's work really identified the extent to which wolf predation was affecting the livestock industry in southwestern Alberta. And then work that spouse has done and others have done on grizzly bears, especially in the mountains, of course, that's where the grizzly bears are in Alberta primarily, showed that grizzly bears are very effective predators on elk calves. And I have seen grizzly bears working a meadow in an elk calving area, and they just systematically go back and forth, and they're good at it. And some work by Barbara Meyer in Yellowstone National Park showed that almost half of the calves are being killed by grizzly bears. And we certainly have substantial grizzly bear mortality in the mountain units of Alberta. Cougars will also take elk, and numbers of cougars have increased substantially. And it's due to reduced persecution, just like for wolves and for grizzly bears, that the numbers of these large carnivores have increased because we've restricted the harvest, and we've stopped poisoning them by and large. We still poison wolves up in Smoky, but by and large we don't poison like we used to. And so these large carnivores have responded very well, but also because we have restored some of the game species that they depend on. And so we had to look to see where the predator compensation claims were coming from in Alberta. And this is a map that shows that. And these dots are where we have the largest number of, well, the size of the dot reflects how many claims we have in that area. And the color of these blocks through here, the color of each WMU is based on the total number of hunting days per WMU. So those areas where we have the most hunting, where we have the largest big game populations, are also the places where we have the most large carnivores. And if you break it down and look to see who's doing what, well, this is a log scale, so sorry about that. So the log of log base 10 of 2 is about 100, is what, exactly 100. Log base 10 of 1 is 10. And so, there are about 10 black bear claims and a little more than 10 cougar claims. Cougars and black bears are not large predators on livestock. Grizzly bears are increasing in their significance, but they're still substantially below. So here in 2001, you can see that it was right about 10. But wolves were about 100 and increasing. So wolves are far and away the biggest cost as it relates to livestock depredation, and it's reflecting the increased numbers of wolves that we now have on the landscape. So now let's just have a look at what's going on with elk harvests. Up till 1997, the old timers in the crowd will remember that you had to buy a stamp to go hunting for various species. So this is an elk stamp from 1992. But the punchline here is that the harvest of elk by hunters has increased, both for general license as well as for special harvest. So, but by general harvest, we mean throughout many of the mountain units, we have a general license where you can harvest any bull that's more than 3 points, 3 points or more. Whereas with special harvest, we have targeted removals of cow elk, for example, get a cow elk tag, but both have increased substantially over Alberta over time. Hunter success has increased significantly, and we'll talk about that significance issue in a minute. But we have, over time, despite the fact that we've had increases in large carnivores, we've also had increases in elk. Hunter effort really hasn't changed. There's no significant trend in hunter effort. But then there's this ugly statistical issue of a particular trend. So if you look at the trend in a particular WMU, you can't really make much out of that because of an ugly statistical thing called autocorrelation. And what that says is that the number of elk that we harvest next year is going to be related to the number of elk that we harvested this year, because the number of elk we have next year is going to be straight up a consequence of how many we've got this year. And so we don't have independence over the time series, meaning we have to find some sort of a statistical trick. And these two guys, Barry Noon and John Sauer, came up with a solution, and it's called root regression. It comes from John's work on the breeding bird survey. Well, both these guys working on the breeding bird survey data, and the reason it's called root regression is because we have all these breeding bird survey routes. And how do you make sense out of the trends that we see in any particular route? So these guys were looking at upland sandpipers and bobolinks and all these songbirds and blue jays and the various species that were counted on the breeding bird surveys. John Sauer was a former student of mine back in the 70s. Barry Noon is a professor at Colorado State, long-term friend over the years, but they came up with a statistical method where you basically, the idea is that if you've got if you look at individual routes and you look at the trend in an individual route, and then you go to the next route and you look at that trend, and you go to the next route and you look at that trend, your replication comes from route after route after route. Well, we have the same setup in Alberta looking at WMUs. And so we look at trends by WMU, and we can look at trends for the 100 units down in the prairies, the 200 units, the 300 units in the foothills, the 400 units in the mountains, and then the 500 units up in the boreal. And so we can study trend that occurs by zone by using as replicates the WMU. And so I had a student, Tyler Trump, who did exactly this, and he demonstrated that indeed in 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, and 500 level WMUs, that we've seen an increase in the number of elk that we've harvested over time, and we've seen an increase in the hunter success, and we've seen no change in hunter effort. The exception are the mountain units, and we believe that the low recruitment that we're getting due to predation in the mountain units sets them apart. But and grizzly bears almost surely play a major role there. But everybody blames wolves, and so I go elk hunting and I see some wolf tracks, and it's hard not to think wolves are getting some of those elk, and so that's why I didn't get one this year. Well, you did get one this year, and the hunter success has been high, and so Mark Hurley, who is the deer biologist for Idaho, gave me an update on what's going on in Idaho, and they have exactly the same pattern. That there are a few of the remote wilderness areas where they've seen declines in elk harvest, but overall, even after wolf reintroduction, which happened in 1995 in central Idaho, even after wolf reintroduction, they've had increased harvest. And, you know, to hear the hunters talk and to hear the Idaho Fish and Game administration, their board talk, you know, it's all because of, you know, that nobody can get an elk because there are too many wolves. Well, it's just not true. And it's exactly the same in Montana. We've got wolves now in Montana, and they're harvesting wolves in Montana and in Idaho. But the number of elk being harvested just keeps going up, and somehow people aren't paying attention to what the data say. You didn't get your elk this year, and by God, it's because of the wolves. And I just want to point out that it's definitely true that our hunter success has declined in these mountain units. And some of you who may have hunted Yahatinda, for example, it's not a good place to go for elk anymore. You just need to regroup and go where the elk are and where the harvests are occurring. And the hunter success and the number of elk being taken out of the 300 units and up into the 500 units here up in the Peace Country have substantially increased. Now, on top of this Volterra Principle, now let me step back again and remind you that the Volterra Principle tells us that in a predator-prey interaction, if we harvest both the predators and the prey, if we're killing predators such as wolves and cougars, and we're killing the prey, the elk, the outcome is going to be an increase in the equilibrium abundance of elk and a decrease in the equilibrium abundance of cougars and wolves. I didn't bring bears into that equation for political reasons. If I were Jason Nixon, I would be a little bit terrified of the prospect of bringing the hunt back on grizzly bears. But that doesn't say that it's necessarily a bad idea, but it's a politically cumbersome thing. But we've got the Volterra Principle for starters to help us understand how it is that we can have increasing numbers of elk despite the fact that we've got all these large carnivores. But on top of that, we have a big difference in the animals that are being killed by large carnivores. So Rolf Peterson and Dave Meach and I had a major project going on in Yellowstone National Park after wolves were reintroduced. And this is some of the work that Rolf's student summarized from that effort. And what this does is to show the age distribution of cow elk killed by hunters, and those are these yellow bars, versus the age distribution of cow elk killed by wolves. And you can see that wolves kill young. They do not kill prime aged cows. Ages 2 to 10 are almost wolf proof. But then older cow elk are highly vulnerable to wolf predation. So once you start to slow down, you get a little arthritic and older age, and the wolves just nail it. So there's a huge difference. And basically hunters are shooting the first elk you get a chance to shoot. They're taking them almost in relative to their composition in the population. But and if you look at the reproductive value, so this is the contribution of an individual to population growth. Okay? So how important is an individual elk to the growth of that elk population? Well, you can see here that the reproductive value is highest for 2, 3, 4, up to about 10. So these ages up here are the ones that are the most valuable to the growth of the population. These older age ones that are being killed by the wolves, they're not worth much. And it's because they're not going to live very much longer. The most valuable elk in the population is about a 2 or 3 year old cow elk. They are they have the greatest significance in terms of population growth. But just look at that distinction between the hunter kill and the wolf kill. Wolves are taking animals that have much less consequence. So the fact that you might encounter a wolf-killed elk out in the bush someplace, that's not the same as one that your neighbor shot. And so the effect of hunters is much more significant on population dynamics of elk than is wolf predation. So again, this amplifies the Volterra principle, and selectivity by predators is a significant and important consideration. So the punchlines for my presentation, and one that I feel strongly about, is that the strongest inference and the most reliable knowledge is going to occur when we have this interplay between theory, where we've got an ecological theory basis for decision making, and this interface between theory and data is what I believe is the best science. And you know, if you think about the predictions from the Volterra principle that comes out of predator-prey theory, there's a comfortable coexistence, meaning that if we're out there harvesting both the predators and the prey, the hunters are the ones who really benefit in that balance, because we, by harvesting both the predator and the prey, we're actually increasing the long-term abundance of our prey, the elk, and reducing the long-term abundance of the predators. So despite these large carnivore populations, elk are sustainably managed in Alberta. Hate to admit it, but Fish and Wildlife's doing a damn good job, and we're the beneficiaries of that management. But finally, there's been a lot of appreciation, I think, in the last 10 to 20 years about the role that predators play in ecosystem structure and function, and that they're not necessarily a bad thing to have around. And in fact, this was Paul Arrington's major message back in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, was that he saw predator control out of control back at that time. You know, people would shoot any hawk that flew over, eagles were targeted, coyotes, wolves, foxes, any kind of a predator was deemed to be a bad animal. Whereas, you know, when you get right down to it, it's the habitat. And if the habitat is sufficient and adequate for both the predator, for the prey, you can have predators and prey, and have a sustainable harvest as well. So I have had fantastic graduate students, and my whole program has been dependent upon these kids. Christine Robichaud worked on wolves. Andrea Morehouse worked on wolves for her master's, and then worked on grizzly bears for her PhD. Kyle Knopf worked on cougars, did his PhD work on cougars, and then Tyler has been studying the elk data, and with the assistance of Cassandra Hardy and Rob Corrigan. So if that didn't stir up some controversial discussion, I don't know what I can say that would. Predator prey is always a hot topic, and especially when you get wolves and bears in the mix. But I'll turn it back to Victor to moderate the discussion, and happy to take it on.
So thanks very much, Dr. Boyce. Raise your hands if you have questions or put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and I will bring them out. First person up is Gord Poirier. Go ahead, Gord.
Yeah, I just had to unmute. I got to be the first on all three of them, don't I? Anyway, thank you, Dr. Boyce. I have a cousin up in the Spirit River area, and the cow elk license, as you showed, the hunters tend to take the best breeders out of the situation, and for him, that's exactly what he wants. They want to lower, the owners of the properties out there want to lower the elk population. They
That's
also
the way to
shoot
do
every
it.
wolf they see too.
Hunters have had more influence in the dynamics of elk in Yellowstone, especially during that first decade, than did the wolves, because like that slide showed, the hunters are taking the prime age animals that have the biggest influence on population growth for the elk. But sometimes that's what we want. Sometimes we want to do just like you alluded to. We want to reduce those herds, and the way to do it is to shoot cows.
Anything more, Gord? Anyone else interested in hearing what Dr. Boyce has to say? Oh, we've got a question in the chat from Darren Banish. Can you provide any solutions to the predator pit problem? I believe that's the term was originally used by Dr. Val Geist in the mountain zones, the 400s.
No question about what the mountain zones are getting hit pretty hard by predators. And the work at Yahatinda that Ebby and Mark Hebblewhite have been doing indicates that grizzly bear predation is a very major factor. Now, what are the implications there? Well, my suggestion, if you're used to hunting in Yahatinda, just go hunt someplace else. And some of those mountain units are under pressure from predators, and hunter success is lower there than anywhere else. And it has declined. And so one solution as a hunter is you just need to find a place to hunt. You're used to hunting at Yahatinda, and it was fantastic 20 years ago, but it's not fantastic today. Again, as a hunter, that's one solution, is to go someplace else. However, can we deal with the predation in those units? And cougars, nah, we can't touch it. We harvest cougars in areas where there are roads. And the reason is you can drive the roads and you can look for where the cougars cross the tracks, let your hounds out and put them up a tree and take them out. You can't do that well in the mountain units. There isn't the road network in the places where it needs to be. And so that's one problem. So Paul Frame, when he first became a carnivore biologist, whatever that was, 7-8 years ago, he initiated this boot season. So starting basically when bighorn sheep hunting is on, you can take a cougar, and the cougar tags are cheap. Just grab one, stick it in your hip pocket, and get a chance to shoot one. Nobody seems to be able to. We don't kill them. We got, in the first year, 2 in all those mountain units, an unlimited number of tags, 2, and the next year 1. And we're not killing them. And they're very difficult to harvest in the mountain units. We've looked at to see what it is that the cougars are killing, and they're mostly killing deer, but they certainly do kill elk and moose. They can take a cougar. An individual cougar can take just about anything it wants. We had one collared cougar in the Nordig area that in 1 year killed 17 wild horses. I mean, these are 1,000-pound animals. 17 wild horses. They killed 4 moose, 5 elk, and 2 deer. I was just walking by the, I mean, there's a high density of deer, especially at that time. And this big old Tom didn't want anything to do. He liked horse meat. So individual cougars will specialize. And that has been a problem on a couple of times. Once down in Sheep River, and the other time was on Ram Mountain. And so you get an individual cougar that learns how to kill bighorn sheep, and it can have a very significant effect on the local population. Opening it up blanket for cougars isn't going to do anything for you, and most of the cougars are not specializing on bighorns. It's only those cougars that happen to have home ranges that overlap in areas where there are high densities of bighorns that the cougars learn how to become bighorn specialists. So we had a project on exactly that issue in the Catamount area, and indeed we had a couple of cougars that became bighorn specialists, and they were good at killing bighorns. But most of the cougars in the area, despite our attempt to target cougars in that area, most of them were just killing deer. And so does it work to open up a boot season to try to kill more cougars throughout the mountain units? It hasn't worked. We don't know how to kill them. And that it isn't doing all that much good because the predation rate by cougars on bighorns and in the big picture of things is really small. We're talking like 2% or something like that. So it's not a substantial consequence. Should we be harvesting wolves and cougars and bears in the mountain units? Well, just like the Volterra Principle says, if we're harvesting both the predator and the prey, the outcome will be an increase in prey and a decrease in the abundance of predators. We had a problem with grizzly bears because it's politics straight up. And I mean, the grizzly bear hunt was closed in 1996, a moratorium in 1996, and it was closed in 2010. And you know, it's a political. It would be one political hot potato if Jason Nixon were to open up the hunt. I think he'd be happy to do so, but I think he realizes what a political uproar there would be over opening the hunt on grizzly bears. Grizzly bears and wolves are the most difficult things to manage on the planet, probably. But we saw what happened in British Columbia, where they've got probably 17,000 grizzly bears, and they were really well managed. I mean, it was a very carefully designed hunt, and it was shut down strictly for political reasons, had nothing to do with biology. We did a review of the biology of the system in British Columbia, and there was nothing wrong with their harvesting scheme. But when the NDP government came into power, one of the first things they did was to shut down the grizzly bear hunt, and it hasn't been restored since then. So grizzly bears are a very difficult challenge, and they're very good predators on elk calves. So what's it going to do for us? Well, it's going to redistribute perhaps the abundance of elk. We've got fantastic elk habitat right now out in the foothills with the logging programs that are in place. Early cereal stage vegetation is the best for elk. Lots of edge habitats, and the foothills are alive with elk right now. We've got very robust populations of elk, and we're killing more and more of them. But the mountain units are being hit pretty hard with predation, no question about it. And it's not clear to me that we can get over the pit that you're referring to. So Alaska Department of Fish and Game managed Unit 20B by imposing a very heavy harvest on wolves, allowing the moose population to escape from this predator pit. And they were able to bring back the moose population with heavy wolf and bear management. But the only place we have anything like that might be in the mountain units, and we've got the bear problem.
More question from Joe Berenier. What happens when the wolf population increases to such numbers that they start taking more elk and affect the younger breeding population?
Well, they're not doing that. I don't know where that comes from. I mean, that's what a lot of people believe. It's just not the truth. We just look at the data. We're killing more and more elk, despite the fact we've got wolves, and we've got a lot of wolves. The wolf population is pretty well, every territory is occupied by wolves, and to claim that wolves are decimating our elk herds is just not true.
Question from Daryl Smith. Go ahead, Daryl.
Very interesting talk, Dr. Boyce. I'm curious because you did mention at the start of your discussion that the principle behind the Volterra Principle kind of arose after the First World War. Okay, so basically a non-harvest time. We also saw that in the Second World War where there was a lot of non-harvest. And I'm actually going to reframe this question in terms of fisheries. So theoretically, the Volterra Principle should apply regardless of whether it's a wildlife species, a fish species, or whatever. So that I understand. So our current management strategy in Alberta is largely to protect fish up to a certain age. Other words, those fish that have, I'm talking about the piscivorous fish, obviously walleye, northern pike, okay. We allow harvest basically once these fish are spawned 2 or 3 times. However, we're also dedicating harvest generally towards female fish at that time, just because of the growth differential between males and females. I just wanted your comment. Dr. Cook last night talked about the need for a selective harvest. Predation of fish. I guess there's a couple of prime times, young of the year, by birds and things like that, cormorants, pelicans, whatever. But predation later on is maybe not as much of a factor. I just want your comments.
Yes, and it certainly varies a lot from species to species and how we're managing those stocks. I really didn't come prepared to talk about the fisheries, but it's certainly true that selective harvest can alter this balance between different fishes, and we've seen places where this harvesting of both, say, perch and northerns, we see an increase in perch and a decrease in northerns. But so that'd be the kind of thing you'd expect from the Volterra Principle, that the prey species will increase when we're harvesting both of them, whereas the top predators will decrease in their average abundance. So yes, and selectivity is certainly really important in terms of the impact that the anglers are having on the fish stock. So I don't disagree with the word you said, and I'm terribly sorry that I missed Steve Cook's presentation. I would have enjoyed that. But I'm sorry, I don't really have any disagreement with anything you said, and it's an important point that anglers have a selective influence on the fish that we kill, and as does the gear that's used by commercial fishing, say on the West Coast. You know, the mesh size that they use for gill nets has a big selective influence on the size of fish that are removed. And on the West Coast, if you've been halibut fishing out there, you have to release anything that's more than 133 centimeters. So roughly a 70-pounder and above, you have to let go, which is very difficult when you bring up a nice big halibut. But the rationale being that those big, large females are the main breeding stock and produce the most eggs and are the most valuable in that fish population.
So the next question we have is from Gavin Burgay. I hunt elk mainly in the Peace Country and have seen both elk and wolves sometimes in the same hunt. Many farmers wish for an elk cull in some parts of that area. What kind of effect would a cull have on the balance of prey and predator, elk and wolves, if a cull were to be approved?
Well, if we're harvesting both wolves and there's certainly a substantial wolf removal being implemented by Fish and Wildlife in the Little Smoky area just south of there. But if we're harvesting both elk and wolves, the long-term consequence would be an increase in abundance of elk and a reduction in number of wolves. But a targeted elk hunt can be very effective, and by a cull, that's usually means cow tags. And so if we issue more cow tags, we can suppress that elk population. We can be very effective at it. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the question, but so what are the sort of the consequences of imposing a cull? If you reduce the number of prey, you're going to reduce the number of predators as well. Predators depend on the prey. So reducing the prey will reduce the number of predators. That's actually kind of how the Volterra model is working, that the predators are dependent on the prey. And if we deliberately reduce the number of prey by culling cows, we'll have a negative consequence to long-term abundance of wolves in that same area.
We have a question from Brett Calverley. Thank you, Mark, for an excellent presentation. Although slightly off topic, I was wondering if you have any information on the effect of harvesting yearly bull elk in Alberta. We have the 3-point bull elk rule even in areas where we are harvesting all other age and sex classes. Why should spike bulls be protected in these wildlife management units?
Well, I understand the rationale, and that is that in really heavily harvested populations in Utah, it was by a guy by the name of not Pruvo. Having a senior moment here. At any rate, a study in Utah showed that if the number of bulls was reduced substantially enough, that what was happening is that the spike bulls were breeding the cows, and the spike bulls typically were not quite ready by the first estrus, and so they're oftentimes breeding the cows in the second estrus, resulting in calves that are smaller, and the calves have a tougher time making it through the subsequent winter. So we want to avoid that, and so we want to make sure that there are a few branch antlered bulls around to do the breeding, so that we're not relying on spikers to do the breeding. We've also seen in Alaska places where the harvest on bulls was so high that some of the females were not getting bred. And so to ensure good reproductive output, making sure that you've got a few branch antlered bulls in the population is the rationale for protecting the spikers so that they'll be branch antlered bulls next year. And so that and of course the most of the breeding happens in from about the 20th of September until the 5th of October or so, right? The latter half of September is when most of the cows are getting bred. But if they don't get bred during their first estrus, they'll come back into heat about 25 days later. 25, 30 days later. I've forgotten exactly the number of days, but it's right in there. And so they'll come back into heat, and then they'll get bred in that later estrus. And the spike bulls tend to mature a little bit later, and they're ready for the cows typically at that second estrus, but they miss a substantial fraction during the first estrus. Now, that said, the skew in the sex ratio has to be really severe for this to happen, meaning less than 4 or 5% of bulls in the population. If it's that skewed, and some of the places I've hunted, you'll see an awful lot of cows before you see a bull, especially a branch antlered bull. And so the skew might be getting so extensive in some areas that it is a serious consideration. There's nothing tastier than a spiked bull. I've hunted them in Wyoming before, and they're beautiful animals. But I do understand the rationale for the branch antlered bull restriction. Did I answer that sufficiently?
I think so. We have a question from Greg Bird. What are your professional feelings on the bison reintroduction programs that Alberta is currently undertaking, and do you see them as sustainable long term?
Well, I guess I think that some of the populations seem to be doing well. The Hazama herd has been a sustainable herd. We've had some ups and downs, and they've recovered from a decline. But can we have a sustainable harvest on bison herd in Alberta? I should think so. So what do I think about it? So I moved to Alberta in 1999, and the first meeting, the natural resource type meeting that I went to was with Eldon Bruns and Cliff White on the issue of reintroducing bison into Banff National Park. And Eldon Bruns was the wildlife biologist out of Rocky Mountain House, and he was just dead set against it because he knew what would happen is that the bison herd would build up. They couldn't keep them behind a fence. They couldn't prevent them from moving out into the out onto agricultural lands, out to Sundre and other places, and that they just get themselves into trouble. They'd walk through fences and create conflict with agriculture. He didn't want anything to do with it. Cliff White, on the other hand, is making the case that we lost this native species from the fauna of Banff National Park, and wouldn't it be wonderful to have them back? We got them. Now we've got them, and that we've already had a couple bulls kind of go on a foray, and they were removed. Now, one of the solutions that the park promoted during this period of advocating for bison recovery was to develop a hunt for bison when they left the park, and that way they'd be able to remove dispersers, and it should provide a hunting opportunity for people who wanted to take a bison when they left the park. And there may be some reception for that proposal, but it has certainly not been sorted out yet. But I'd love to hunt a bison under circumstances like that. So at any rate, yes, I do believe there are sustainable bison populations that we can maintain in Alberta, but I think that hunting is a nice interface there to prevent conflicts with agriculture in particular.
So we have Joe Berenier. Go ahead, Joe. Unmute yourself and speak up.
Thank you. Dr. Boyce, I was wondering, my question on if the wolf population increases, would that have an effect with the numbers? Would that change the breeding population? Would they go after the breeding population, and will that have an effect on it with an increase in wolf population?
Well, just a few comments about that. I don't know where we're going to put any more wolves. They'd have to be out in the white zone someplace, because pretty much every territory that's available for them in the green zone is occupied, and a pack is limiting. You can't put more wolves on the landscape, and the wolves depend on the prey. If they don't have prey, they won't be there. The pack size, the size of the pack territories increases when density of prey is lower. But the number of wolves on the landscape decreases when we have fewer prey. So I guess it's kind of it strikes me that the question's a little bit backwards in that I don't know where we're going to put more wolves or where they're going to come from. And so an increasing wolf population doesn't strike me as much of a threat. We've got about as many wolves as you could possibly muster right now. And so the province's estimate is 7,000 wolves in Alberta. And we've run the numbers, and I don't think that that's very likely. I think it's closer to 6,000 wolves. But there's a whack of them. And like I said, just about every territory is occupied. The registered trapline system is very effective at maintaining wolf populations, because you can only harvest wolves within your registered trapline. You can't just sort of go anywhere willy-nilly and harvest wolves. So most trappers are not very good at it. Most trappers only take 1 or 2 wolves. And the number of trappers in Alberta who take more than 5, you can count on your fingers. There are very few really good wolf trappers out there. But part of the reason they're not going to take very many is because they can only trap on their trap line. So you might have, so the average trap line's a couple of townships. You might have 2 packs on your trap line. The average pack size in central Alberta is about 7. So even if you whack every one of them, you're still not going to get much more than about 10, 12 wolves, an individual trapper. But the next trap line, probably nobody taking wolves at all. Only about 50% of our trap lines are active in any particular year. And so this registered trap line system ensures a dispersion of trapping effort across the landscape. You're not going to have wolves wiped out substantially over any substantial area by trappers. Now the case study up in the Lesser Smoky is interesting, because for the last 17 years maybe, We have harvested, the province of Alberta has removed between 100 and 130 wolves year after year after year out of the Little Smoky. And within weeks, they're back. So the surrounding landscape is chock-a-block full of wolves. And if you create a void, there are plenty floaters in the population that will come right back into those areas and repopulate. And so they have to take them out. They have to remove 100 to 130 wolves year after year, and we're going to have to continue to do it forever if we're going to try to manage that Little Smoky caribou herd with wolf control. So I'm sorry, I totally forgot your question. You got me going.
Let's move on to Paul Short. What discussions are ongoing between natural resource science and the Aboriginal traditional knowledge related to wildlife management?
It's a very complex topic, and I'm not qualified to speak to it.
Okay. We have another one.
But just
sorry.
Well, let me make one comment though, and that is that the territories north of us have a co-management system, and that may be a direction that we will see developing over time. I know that there's resistance to having that happen, but it may be how we can actually get data on what's going on with the Aboriginal harvest. So I'm sorry, go ahead, Vic.
Another question from Paul. The chart showing the relationship between hunter harvest of younger cow elk by hunters and the wolf predation does not address the effect of wolf hunting or on the stress related to the success of reproduction by younger elk. Is there a study on this?
So the question is, if we have wolf hunting, that disrupts the social structure of the wolf pack and might lead to less selective killing by the wolves. I don't think so. In fact, if anything, it's going to exacerbate it because younger wolves are even less efficient as predators than our prime the alpha pair. And so no, I don't think so at all. The elk that are most vulnerable to wolf predation are the young yearling, the calves and yearlings, and the old elk older than about age 10, as we saw from that diagram. And I cannot see how harvesting of wolves is going to affect that. If anything, it would exacerbate it. So we know that trappers are highly selective in the wolves that they remove, and they tend to remove young wolves. Hunters, we get a bigger mix of adults and young wolves in the hunter harvest of wolves. But trappers are highly selective for young wolves because they're not as smart as the older wolves.
A question from Alan Hugo. Is wolf predation affecting the age class of bulls or the reproductive success?
Good question. I don't know.
I think this is because the chart was referring primarily to cow elk.
Yes.
So just wondering.
Yeah.
Going
Bulls
back.
don't live.
Sorry.
Just one comment there. Bulls don't live very long. For a bull to live to be a 7-year-old bull, wow, that's really extraordinary.
I see. So back to Joe Bernier. Unmute yourself and go ahead, Joe.
My question was answered. I'm sorry, I forgot to lower my hand.
Okay, thank you. We'll go back to Daryl Smith.
I won't give you a fish question this time, Mark. Okay, so essentially what I get out of the talk is that our predators and their prey are fairly much in balance within this province, okay? Except for perhaps the issue along these slopes where you've indicated the grizzly bears are perhaps predating at a higher rate than the population can sustain. With that said, though, if I look at the animal rights movement or even the environmentalists, that they're suggesting that, and I'd like, Chris, I think you know where I live, but I live pretty close to a little smoky caribou herd here in the Peace Country. But the issue is that the environmental group have suggested that there are not enough predators on the landscape. In other words, predators are actually deficient, that they're not at that sustainable levels or at the levels that they historically would be. Now, you mentioned the wolf number of 7,000, which is part of the management strategy in Alberta, which has suggested that number. But I guess my question is that how do you counteract this, I guess, mindset that so-called climax predators or the top end predators are actually doing well, at least in Alberta, with the perception that much of the public has that we need to do everything to protect the wolf, we need to do everything to protect cougars, grizzly bears, even black bears, when actually they're in fact being sustainably managed.
Yes, that's a very complex socio political kind of issue, and I would say that we do as well with predator management in Alberta as any jurisdiction, and we coexist with large carnivores as well as any place in North America. We've got a pretty good system. We have highly regulated harvest of cougars. Wolf harvests are probably as high as we can muster just because of the registered trapline system. And so we're harvesting both wolves and cougars. We're not harvesting grizzly bears. And I do believe that there's probably a conflict because of that. But nevertheless, our large carnivore populations are doing really well. They have recovered so amazingly during the time that I've been in Alberta, which is only 22 years. We've seen substantial increases and expanded distribution. If you look at Burton Grossenheiter, which is the Mammals of North America, published in 1954, the northern extent of distribution for cougars was the Wilmore. We now have cougars into NWT and the Yukon, all across Alberta. There's not a municipal district or county in Alberta that doesn't have cougars. And like I said, the green zone is pretty well saturated with wolves. We're doing a good job of maintaining large carnivores and coexisting with them, but we are also harvesting the large carnivores. And so this Volterra principle is working in our favor from the standpoint of a hunter, in that we've got substantial populations of elk and deer, and we have certainly viable populations of large carnivores. There's no question but what there are some people who will never be happy with any harvest of large carnivores. But we certainly do it in a very sustainable way in Alberta. And I think our management system is sustainable and it's working really well. So that's the best I can manage with that question, but how we deal with an uneducated populace that relate more to the animal than to sort of the population, that's a really tough one. And we just need to improve public education.
We have a question from Daryl Banish. You started the presentation talking about how science should be implemented more in decisions about wildlife management. Elk cull tags and seasons, generally, if not exclusively cow tags, seem to be more based on farmer rancher complaints than carrying capacity concerns. Were you to apply science to those decisions, would those extra seasons be reasonable?
Well, I'm awfully glad that I'm an academic and I don't have to make those decisions, because wildlife management involves balancing all of those kinds of considerations. If your management area includes a substantial amount of agricultural land, and there are conflicts with elk on your haystacks and conflicts over forage, it has to be taken into consideration in the seasons that are set and the quotas that are established. But some of those decisions are obviously very difficult. I tend to lean on in favor of wildlife, but at the same time, I think that some of our livestock producers are doing an awfully good job of managing their rangelands, and we need to support them. And if that means reducing elk herds in some areas, I guess if I were a manager, I'd have to take that into serious consideration. So I'm waffling a little bit on that, but it's a tough one. And like I said, I'm an academic, and I can give advice and not have to live with it. But these guys who are out there making the tough decisions have to live with it.
So here's Paul Short in person. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I think that I was referring to the question related to the harvest of younger cow elk by the hunter population versus wolves. And my question was really along the process of hunting by the wolves. My limited knowledge is that they test the capacity of the prey to the extent that they are able to find one that is not necessarily easy prey, if I can use that word. That process of testing has to add stress to the cows when they are bearing young. And is there any studies that show the relationship? I don't think that the elk or that the wolves will sit down and have a council and say, well, we'll only find the cows, elk above 8 years old. They don't discriminate, as I understand it. So that the pressure that they would be putting on the younger cows who are in calf, is there a study that looks at the reproductive success of the cows? Because that really is the metric that is being used in the presentation we received earlier this year by Fish and Wildlife that said we look at the success projections for recruitment to the herd and base our harvest on those numbers. So I'm just asking the questions about the success ratio of reproduction by the younger cows as they are being pressured by the wolf population. Is there studies?
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of such a study.
Okay.
And you're absolutely right that the mechanism by which we see older elk being taken by wolves is like they test them, and the ones that look like they might be a little easier to take, those are the ones that get taken. And the prime age cows from age 2 to age 10 are very unlikely to be killed by wolves. But whether or not with their being tested, whether or not that affects reproductive output, I am not aware of a study that demonstrates that.
We've got a request from Matt. Are you able to show the cow elk graph again, please? I presume he's talking about the hunters versus wolf kills against the age. That one, yeah.
Well, went away.
It went away. Yes, there it is.
Let's try again. There we go.
So just to reiterate what you're telling us, the Dr. Boyce is in the very young cows. There's a certain amount of wolf predation, and then essentially it's fairly flat from 2 to 10. And then the older cows fall to the wolves, and a majority of the wolf kills are in that area. And the human hunters essentially take out the younger cows.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so human hunters take them pretty much in the proportion that they occur in the population. Most of us, when we get a shot at a cow elk, if we've got a cow elk tag, we'll take the first cow that we get a chance to shoot. We're not assessing whether it's an old cow or, and I don't think I could tell a 13-year-old cow from a 7-year-old cow. They're, you know, I don't know that we would be able to detect the age nearly as well as the wolves can, because the wolves are out there testing them. But as hunters, we're pretty much taking them in proportion to their occurrence in the population.
Thank you. So we have a question from Gordon Smereka. In the northeast area of the province, we are seeing a small elk herd forming. Do you think these releases are from elk farms or from a natural comeback?
Well, I think there is a natural comeback of elk. We have elk here. So I'm just east of Sherwood Park, and we have elk in this area that have been rebuilding, and they're not. Pretty sure they're not from elk farms. So yeah, sometimes wildlife escape from behind the fence, no question about it. Especially wild boar, they're really good at getting through the fence. But whether or not that's a significant contribution to the expanding populations in northeastern Alberta, I haven't seen any evidence that that's likely to be the case, but I don't know. I have no data on that. I've seen no data on that.
So here's Gord Poirier again.
Hello again. You mentioned predators and elk and deer and that, but you didn't mention how the predator-prey relationship works with moose. Across the continent, or the moose population seems to be in trouble. Are predators a chief cause of this problem?
No, I don't think so, and I don't think anybody has actually even claimed that that's the case. And moose are not in trouble in Alberta, and they're not in trouble in Saskatchewan. There are places, especially in the South, like in Southern Ontario and in Minnesota, Michigan, and there's a lot of research going on related to that very question. And it's certainly true that parasites are an important factor in some populations. My good friend Bill Samuel has been studying winter ticks for his career, and we certainly get some pretty serious winter tick infestations in some of these southern herds. But I'm not aware of a good claim that predators are actually the cause of declines in moose populations in those areas where they have been declining.
And here we have Paul Short.
Doctor, you haven't spoken about caribou in Alberta, and it's an issue which I'm interested in hearing your concern or your considerations around the prey relationship with all of these chock-a-block full green zone wolf populations, and your comment about the hundreds of wolves that are being harvested per year in the Little Smoky. Realistically, what's the possibility of the management plans bringing back these caribou herds to a point of sustainability? Your opinion, please.
That's a tough one, Paul. And and I disagree with some of my colleagues on this issue. I think that we are going to lose some populations of caribou because of what we've done to the habitat. And I don't believe anyone would argue that the real problem in the Little Smoky is the habitat loss. And we continue to log and we continue to drill in the Little Smoky. And we're using predator control as sort of an excuse to keep doing what we've been doing. And so until we figure out that habitat's the bottom line, we're going to have these conflicts. And I can't imagine how we could truly do recovery on a Little Smoky herd with predator control. It's a losing battle. We're talking 100 years out before we get the old growth characteristics that are necessary to have sufficient arboreal lichens and to support the caribou. That it just the recovery of old growth conditions in the forest to be able to maintain the caribou is going to take a very long time, and I won't see it in my lifetime, that's for sure. And I'm not very confident that the public is going to tolerate the poisoning of wolves in the Little Smoky for the long term. And so I think that we're fighting a losing battle. So again, my opinion is not shared by several of my colleagues. And her view, for example, feels quite strongly that we must do everything we can to prevent the Little Smoky herd from winking out. And the Little Smoky herd is an important one from a conservation standpoint because it's truly a boreal lowland herd adjacent to these mountain herds, but a long ways from other boreal herds. And so it's a pretty special one in the context of the genetic diversity of caribou across the landscape. But without the habitat and without a concerted effort to ensure habitat, we can't expect, in my opinion, to use wolf poisoning as a viable management alternative for the long term. So again, my opinion, not the opinion of many of my colleagues, but I just think that the societal pressure against poisoning of wolves is going to increase over time.
Here's Paul again.
No, I had my answers very clearly. It's not just the Alopesh, Little Smoky, but all of the 7 key herds in the boreal. I mean, they're all under pressure, not only just by the industrial pressure, but also by the predation pressure that you've eloquently described. So if they are, by the very consequence of being the lowest hanging fruit in terms of the wildlife, the moose being a higher risk factor, and the wolves easier to get to now because of the caribou because of the access issues. Really, what chance do we have in Alberta to bring these things back to a sustainable program? I mean, you've answered the Alopesh and the Little Smoky, but in the larger scheme of things, what's the real risk, or what's the real chance of us, from a science standpoint, achieving the outcome that the Species at Risk Act that the federal government's holding over us will be successful?
Well, so Stan Booten has a pretty nice paper about that, in which he calls it triage. And that is that we look to see which herds have a viable number of animals in them, and where the hydrocarbon resources underneath those landscapes is low enough that we might be able to forego development in some of those areas to ensure the long-term viability of certain herds. The Caribou Mountain herd, the Bestu Lake herd, some of these northern herds that as of now haven't had substantial industrial development yet. If we could set a few of these herds aside, we could probably have caribou in Alberta for the long term. But the government's unwilling to give up any potential royalty revenues from the extraction of oil and gas. They're not going to give up on any timber harvest if they can avoid it, and they're not willing to make any concessions for caribou. So if we don't protect the habitat, we won't have the caribou. The predator issue is really almost beside the point. We've got to have the habitat.
A comment from Daryl Smith. Thank you for your candid answers to questions which are tied so closely to social and economic issues. And back to Paul Short again.
I had lowered my hand.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. I took a class from Val Geist at University of Calgary, so that just shows you how old I am. So IT and I are not the favorite thing. Sorry about that, folks.
No problem. Go ahead, Brian.
Dr. Boyce, the one that always kind of puzzles me, and maybe this is just another diversion tactic, but we read about the strategy where they want to reduce elk and moose population numbers in areas where caribou exist to better protect the caribou. Can you delve a little deeper into that one and maybe clear some fog for me?
Yes, actually, I do think that there's good evidence. Well, unquestionably, there's good evidence for this, what's called apparent competition. And Stan Booten has been at the forefront of some of that work, but it's also occurred in a number of studies in Ontario and in the Yukon and in BC and even in the old world, in the region of boreal reindeer across Siberia. exactly the same thing is happening, that when we have industrial development, we have logging and oil and gas development that creates an increase in early seral stage vegetation, meaning willows and aspen, young growth. The elk and deer and moose thrive in that kind of habitat, but not the caribou. And what happens is that you see an increase in these alternative prey, the elk and the moose and the deer. And that means that there are more wolves, and just as a consequence of having more wolves on the landscape, as well as more roads and cut lines, making it easier for the wolves to get around, it results in apparent competition. It's called apparent competition because it looks like we've got these ungulates increasing in abundance, causing a reduction in the number of caribou. But it isn't competition at all. It's a predator effect, because we increase the prey base, we increase the number of wolves, and they're just whacking the caribou incidentally. So yes, I think that's a valid case, and I understand why Alberta Fish and Wildlife issues abundant permits in for deer and moose in areas where there are caribou, to try to reduce the alternative prey, to reduce the prey base for the wolves, so that there's less predation pressure on the caribou.
So, Dr. Boyce, I have a question. I've recently become aware that in certain specific areas in the province, when there have been problem grizzlies in particular, I'm thinking central Alberta along the Rocky Mountains, that there have been a number of grizzly bears that have been captured, and unfortunately, most of them have had to be put down, and the explanation we were given is that there's really nowhere to put them. Is that a reflection, in your opinion, of that we're getting close to carrying capacity?
Yes. Yes. So we have data on translocated bears from the earliest publication on this was out of the Yellowstone ecosystem, but now in Alberta we've been monitoring it as well. And translocated bears are much more likely to die. And one of the papers that comes to mind, it was a 5-fold increase in mortality rate of a translocated bear versus one that was not translocated. And the reason is you put them into a place where there are already bears, and they're going to come into conflict with the local bears. So you put let's say it's an old male that gotten himself in trouble. We put him into an area where there's already another old male in the same area. He's going to kill him, or they're going to have a heck of a fight. And translocating younger bears, they're almost doomed to die. So if we have good bear habitat, we'll probably have bears there, and to try to put more bears in there is not going to be successful. So that's one reason that the bears don't do well. But also, if a bear gets into trouble, it's learned some bad habits, and putting them into a new place is just going to mean they're going to get into trouble someplace else. And that's oftentimes the case. A bear that has been managed, meaning it's been moved, is likely to go get into trouble again. And we have studied that actually, and it's definitely true that. So I understand why we see Fish and Wildlife officers removing problem bears. I also understand that there are things we can do to try to minimize conflict with landowners. Electric fencing, for example, around grain bins, things like that are so successful. Getting rid of boneyards and trying to minimize the opportunity for conflict. Reducing attractants is the number one effective mechanism for reducing conflicts with grizzly bears. That's in sort of in the bag of tricks. I think that's the most important one to follow up on, trying to minimize the conflict with the bears. But relocating the bears is oftentimes not very successful. And there are some places where, you know, we've been relocating bears year after year, and they don't do very well. And it's amazing how effectively some of them are able to go back home. You know, we've had bears that have gone 500 kilometers from a release site, and they'll just head right back home again.
So we're running towards the end of the show here. We'll put on Paul Short for a last question. Oh, where'd he go? I had him. Oh, there he is. Go ahead, Paul.
I had no question. It's the IT in me that's having a mess up. Sorry about that, folks.
No problem. We have a question from the panel from Darren Banish. In the 400 zones south of the Sheep River, there's been a fair amount of timber harvest recently that has reduced the amount of old growth forest in these areas. Some of these are large cut blocks. Aside from providing a food source for ungulates, which the old forest was reducing, do these habitat changes affect the ability of wolves, bears, etc., to predate on elk?
So the timber harvest itself, probably no. And timber harvest will improve the vegetation for elk. It maxes out at about 9 to 11 years post harvest, meaning the amount of food in a forest block will peak out at about 9 to 11 years after harvest. Now that depends on how it's managed. If you know, the best thing is, of course, if they just leave it after they harvest it and don't mess around with it. But sometimes the intensity of management of the landscape reduces the recovery of elk forage in those cut blocks. But if, like I said, if they just leave it alone after either a fire or a cut, we'll have increased elk production, elk forage production. For the max is out at about 11 years, and then it gradually tapers off as the canopy starts to fill in. And so, you know, once you get to about a 40-year-old stand, there isn't very much available for the elk. So you want to have ideally a patchwork quilt of different age stands across the landscape for a variety of reasons, but one of them is to maximize the habitat capability of the landscape for elk and other ungulates. Did I answer the question?
I believe you did.
Good.
We seem to have run out of questions. We're slowly losing audience one by one. Brian, do you want to jump in here and wrap up the evening for us, please?
You bet. Thanks, Victor. Thank you, Dr. Boyce, for sharing your wisdom with us. I know our questions sometimes led us into different topics, but it's not all or every day that we get an opportunity to sit down with someone with your awareness and be able to run some of these questions and issues past someone like yourself. So we greatly appreciate your time, especially with a holiday weekend coming up. And I know that there's lots of spottings of snow geese, so we, are much appreciative, and look forward to possibly having discussions like this again with you. So thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Brian. My pleasure.
And from all of us here at the AFGA, thank you very much for joining us for these 3 nights of special webinars covering all the major chairs with the AFGA. Have a great evening and have a great Easter weekend. Good night, everyone.
Happy Easter.